So the title of today's lesson is Iraq, Confronting a Dictatorship. And our question for today is, how should the United States deal with dangerous dictators? Because let's be honest, we're going to talk about overcoming a regime controlled by an individual who believed his power to be absolute within his country. And yet there are still remaining dictators in this world, and we'll look at one of the more famous examples in North Korea at the end of the lesson. And yet the question still remains, how should the United States deal with dictatorships around the world? Well, first, a bit of historical perspective. In August of 1990, the Iraqi army invaded Kuwait. We've learned about this previously. The dictator of Iraq was known as Saddam Hussein, and it was his goal in the first Persian Gulf War to acquire Kuwait's huge oil reserves. The United Nations condemned this occupation and approved the use of force to end it. And this began the Persian Gulf War. This war was conducted in 1991. It was a rather short conflict. Coalition forces led by the United States drove Iraq out of Kuwait within 6 weeks. There was only 3 days of ground fighting and roughly 2 weeks of air conflict, and within 6 weeks the war was over. The agreement which ended the war prohibited Iraq from producing biological or nuclear weapons and mandated that Iraq leave the tiny state of Kuwait alone.
Iraq and its leaders must be held liable for these crimes of abuse and destruction.
January the 17th, 1991, 3 a.m. Iraq time. Hell breaks loose on Baghdad. The formidable firepower of the coalition, amassed primarily by the United States over the past 5 months, reveals its awesome might. Televisions worldwide start showing images of a supposedly foolproof, high-precision campaign of so-called surgical bombings said to hit nothing but Iraqi military targets. February the 23rd, 1991. The coalition ground forces start rolling in Kuwait. The Allied offensive gets fast and deep into Kuwait without encountering significant resistance. The Iraqi military Leviathan is nowhere in sight. And the troops still present in Kuwait are simply no match for the modern coalition forces. On February the 28th, 1991, having fulfilled its mission, the international coalition abruptly stops the war against Iraq. The last Iraqi troops are evicted from Kuwait or taken prisoners. Victory is total.
Now, following the Iraq War, United Nations weapons inspectors were sent periodically to conduct inspections in Iraq to ensure compliance with the agreement which ended the Persian Gulf War. Saddam Hussein often refused to cooperate fully with these inspectors, hindering their investigations. In fact, in 1998, the United States and Great Britain declared that they supported the removal of the dictator Saddam Hussein. And Hussein responded by refusing to allow further arms inspections and further inspectors from entering the country of Iraq. After the September 11th attacks, President George W. Bush feared that Saddam Hussein would provide terrorists with weapons of mass destruction. We call them WMDs for short. The United States called for renewed arms inspections in Iraq, And in 2002, the United Nations passed a resolution to force Iraq to give up any weapons of mass destruction within their country. Iraq agreed and allowed arms inspectors to come in and to resume their inspections. And yet again, Hussein refused to fully cooperate with inspectors, hindering their investigations. As a result, the United States and Great Britain cut off all diplomatic relations with Iraq. This is not a declaration of war. However, this means a removal of any U.S. diplomats from the country. This means a ceasing of communications as well as any foreign aid that we might have been sending to Iraq. In 2003, U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell declared that Iraq was hiding weapons of mass destruction within the country. The evidence that he cited was audio tapes, satellite photos, and evidence conducted from interviews from people within the country. He used this evidence to push for a United Nations resolution to authorize the use of force against Iraq. The nations of France and Russia, both permanent members of the Security Council, which is the leading arm of the United Nations, threatened to veto this resolution. Both nations wanted more intense weapons inspections before authorizing the use of force in Iraq. The United States and Great Britain bypassed the United Nations by claiming that Iraq had violated the original ceasefire agreement from the 1991 Persian Gulf War. And they claimed that this justified the use of military force in this instance. And so meanwhile, a protest movement against the possible Iraq war was underway. There were over 600 anti-war rallies around the world. Over 750,000 protesters met in London to protest the possibility of a war with Iraq. Most of these were peaceful. However, generally the response to these protesters was hawkish. In fact, NPR conducted interviews of individuals responding to the protest, and what I'm about to play for you is a clip of protesters' response to a band called the Dixie Chicks. The Dixie Chicks were against the war in Iraq from their very beginning, and they were present at some of these anti-war rallies, and so I'd like to play a segment of this clip for you.
This is Day to Day. I'm Madeline Brand. Off-the-cuff criticism of the Iraq War is risky business for public figures. Just look at the fallout from Senator John Kerry's botched joke about the president's war strategy this week. Perhaps no one appreciates the danger of speaking out against the war more than the band the Dixie Chicks. Just days before the 2003 Iraq invasion, Chicks lead singer Natalie Maines told a London concert crowd that the band was ashamed that President Bush was from her home state, Texas. What happened next is the subject of a new documentary called Shut Up and Sing.
Move to France, Dixie Chicks.
Strong. Be proud of your country. Be ashamed of the Dixie Chicks.
40 and 61 country.
They should send Natalie over to Iraq, strap her to a bomb, and just drop her over Baghdad.
Earlier, I spoke with Shut Up and Sing's co-director Barbara Koppel. She says it wasn't just what Natalie Maines said, it was when she said it.
You know, a lot of people didn't want to disagree with the Bush administration about terrorism and going to war, and so everything was just coming head to head. And Natalie, probably moved by seeing the images of the tanks rolling up and seeing the demonstrations in the streets, came up with this, and she is very anti-war.
And then they carry on with the concert. They're in London, so they don't really realize what's happening back home. And meanwhile, back home,
there is a huge movement abreast, a group called the Free Republic, which is sort of an anonymous group, has just, heard this and gone on their blogs and riled people up, and people are demonstrating and speaking out, and country music cannot believe that these all American women could possibly say anything like this. And so, in a sense, country music feels betrayed by them. So they become then a target for an unprecedented campaign to silence them.
And there are radio boycotts, and
their CDs are crushed, and a death threat on their life.
Did the other two chicks, Marty McGuire and Emily Robeson, they're actually real sisters, and in real life they're sisters. Did they ever resent Natalie Maines for putting them in this situation?
No, they never resented Natalie, and they stuck with her and believed in her, and they also are very anti-war. They went through tough times with their families and explaining it to their families, particularly Emily and Marty, whose mother is rather conservative, but it just made them grow stronger. They just became more independent. They suddenly became free to do the kind of music that they wanted to do. They didn't have to be beholden to anyone, and that's where this new album came from. They wrote songs about infertility. They wrote songs about love. They wrote songs about politics. And it just brought up the best in each one of them.
There's a funny scene in the movie because around this time, they get into this public feud with country music star Toby Keith. And
Yes.
Listeners may remember he wrote that song, Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue, where he talks about where he wants to put his boot. Tell us about that.
Well, Toby Keith had been doing some things to Natalie that she didn't like, which was at his concert pairing her picture with Saddam. And Natalie just felt that she wanted to do something back to Toby Keith, and she had a T-shirt that she thought would be totally safe that said F-U Toby Keith.
The shirt actually said F-U-T-K, right?
Yes, it did. And of course, that then polarized their fans and polarized the Toby Keith fans because they would have shirts that said F-U-D-C, the fans of Toby Keith. The Dixie Chicks, right. And then Natalie says in the movie,
See that person shaking their sign with so much energy, it said F-U-D-C. I almost said,
You said, hey, that's not nice of
we
Dick
love
Clark.
y'all's signs, but what do you have against Dick Cheney?
they felt that this just allowed them to transform and to grow and to mature and to become much more political beings.
And the band took the next 2 years off.
Well, they were writing their new album. Between them, they had 7 babies. So that's a lot of work.
That's a lot of work. And I don't think I've ever seen so many babies in a movie about a rock band before. Maybe in the Metallica documentary, not as many babies, but
It's not about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's about motherhood, sisterhood, writing of music, great musicianship, and most importantly, free speech and not being silenced.
And it's also about the struggle about where they're going to go with their music and if they're going to be country music stars or stars of a different stripe. And they bring in legendary producer Rick Rubin for this new album. And tell us a bit about what they decided in terms of which fan base they now want to appeal to.
Well, I think they just want to appeal to a fan base that will like them for who they are and like their music. And they write about the things that they care about. Anything that they say now and it's not in their songs feels very false to them.
And this new album, it debuted at #1. It went platinum. So record sales alone would seem to indicate that they are still wildly popular.
Wildly popular, but their tour didn't sell out as much as they thought that it would. And they have about 8,000 to 10,000 people that come to their concerts, and it's growing all the time.
And are these country music fans?
I think some of them are country music fans, but most of them are a whole new audience.
Have they been forgiven for that comment yet?
I don't know if they want to be forgiven for that comment. They felt strongly about something, they said it, and they did not want to be silenced. The whole issues of freedom of speech were more important than anything else. So I think they just want to be accepted and understood. And I also think, too, that they're such role models for the next generation. When people say to the next generation, you know, shut up and be nice, maybe the next generation will speak up.
Issues of free speech are still swirling around this because just last week, NBC announced it won't carry ads for your movie. The network said they don't accept ads dealing with a, quote, public controversy.
Yes, that's absolutely true, which seems a little ironic since this is a film about censorship and free speech. But as of today, they have decided to relook at the spots and are showing them.
Barbara Koppel, her new documentary about the Dixie Chicks is called Shut Up and Sing. Barbara Koppel, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
It's been 2 long years now since the top of the world came crashing down, and I'm getting it back on the road now, but I'm taking the long way, taking the long way around.
Now, in March of 2003, George W. Bush gave Saddam Hussein an ultimatum. The dictator had 48 hours to leave Iraq. Saddam Hussein refused, and Operation Iraqi Freedom was ensued. And so you're watching footage of these early air raids. The primary targets of these air raids were sections of the city of Baghdad where Saddam Hussein's elites were stationed. As ground troops raced towards the capital, the city of Baghdad fell within a week. Within a month, the entire country of Iraq was in U.S. coalition-led control. Saddam Hussein was never found at this time, and it was not until later that he would be discovered and put on trial. Meanwhile, the United States hosted a meeting with Iraqi representatives. The purpose was to determine the future of the Iraqi government. The result was a plan that Iraq would respect diversity and create a nation that ruled by law. Shia groups, such as the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolutions in Iraq, objected to U.S. involvement and refused to attend these meetings for the formation of a new democratic Iraqi government. The case for the war was based on the presence of weapons of mass destruction. Upon the U.S. occupation of Iraq, U.S. forces began an extensive search for these WMDs. Mobile biological laboratories were located and found, yet no evidence of any chemical or biological weapons were ever found.
And with that, it is now my pleasure and honor to introduce the President of the United States, George W. Bush.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I present a White House election year album. And this is on the way to the G8 summit. Once I got these trading cards, it's easy to remember the names of the foreign leaders. Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere.
Some have claimed that joke was in poor taste, considering the over 3,000 American soldiers that died in this war. Now, President George W. Bush lumped Iraq, North Korea, and Iran into the, quote, axis of evil, claiming all of these nations were a threat to the United States. And to quote the former president, by seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger. And this is diplomatic speak for suggesting that if these nations are a threat to the safety of our country, then we have the authorization and the necessity to use force against them if we deem necessary. And so, let's briefly discuss North Korea. The dictator of North Korea is Kim Jong-un, who has frequently clashed with the United States over nuclear weapons development. You're watching a fictional scene from the movie The Interview of Kim Jong-il's death. I don't like this guy. I just like to watch him getting blown up repeatedly, so that's what we're going to do. Now, in 1985, North Korea signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They withdrew from this in 2003 and reactivated their nuclear power facilities. The United States continues to keep an uneasy watch on North Korea. In fact, this is one of the 3 most likely places you will be sent overseas if you join the U.S. military. This is still the most tensely guarded border. The demilitarized zone between North and South Korea is still the site of a very uneasy truce. And this truce has been in place since 1953, though it is also one of the most heavily landmined areas on the planet. And because of the situation in North Korea, the United States refuses to sign any agreement outlawing the use of landmines in conflicts, because we have constructed many of the landmines and placed many of the landmines that separate North and South Korea. So the question remains, what to do with this regime? North Korea is a communist state. It is ruled by a dictatorship. Their people are not free. And yet the United States policy has been to support democratic governments and to support the overthrowing of corrupt regimes. And yet we seem to have tolerated the presence of this North Korean dictatorship. And next, let's discuss Iran. Iran has also started to pursue a nuclear program. The United States has viewed this country as a threat because of this, and one update recently, President Obama has brokered a bit of a treaty with Iran in return for the cessation of their nuclear arms development programs. We have opened up relations with this country once more, and we have removed any economic sanctions that were in place since the 1970s when Ayatollah Khomeini took power. Proponents of this treaty believe this could lead to a positive relationship with Iran and a cessation of construction of weapons of mass destruction. Opponents of this treaty believe that we have once again committed to a policy of appeasement when faced with a totalitarian regime. So again, critics claim that we're repeating the mistakes of our past.